Okay, so with our agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about why would you go to grad school. Going to talk a little bit about just the application process in general and some things to think about when it comes to completing those applications too. So this is our, at least at Queen's, this is our career development model we use. And there's four kind of areas that we're always supporting students in developing. So kind of knowing yourself, investigating your options, what's actually out there, creating a bit of a focus, a bit of a plan. So how do I accomplish that? How do I get to those points within my career? And then a big piece of that is communicating your value as well. And all of them are kind of interconnected and connect at the middle there because they're very much interrelated and play off each other. And as we gather new experiences, sometimes things kind of shift around. So just a couple of learning outcomes for today. We're going to talk a little bit about your motivations for attending grad school and how that kind of plays into some of your research, how to gather some of that information. And we'll talk a little bit about deadlines and funding and references too. And then focusing and planning. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space for you folks to think about how you want to focus and how you want to target your research when you are looking at programs. Put together a bit of a list of questions that you might have just to save for later conversations. We're going to talk a little bit about connecting effectively with supervisors and of course some next steps. All of that will lead to working on what do I do next. So thinking about why would I apply to grad school, and this is a conversation I have with students pretty often, is what's kind of the purpose. So I guess maybe I'll kind of ask people to put some responses in the chat, but why would somebody do graduate studies or take some further education? What kind of value would that bring to your career?
I see in the chat to pursue a career in research.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Get some exposure to research, develop some of those research skills. Yeah. You know, it always takes a little bit of time to type out responses. So I like to give people a second if they have ideas. Oh, sorry.
There we go. If your desired field requires more depth of knowledge than what is provided by an undergraduate degree to hone further skills or skills further.
Yep.
Job postings you're interested in, ask for a master's or a PhD.
Yeah, some jobs will require some of that those educational pieces. Yeah, absolutely. And skills further, get some more knowledge. I think these are a bunch of the big pieces. Sometimes it leads to some form of credential as well. Funding, yeah.
Funding for research you are interested in. That's great.
Yeah. Programs do tend to, the funding does tend to be with schools oftentimes. Not the only place, but there is lots of funding at schools for sure. So compared to undergraduate studies, yeah, you do kind of hone in and get, yeah, definitely credential. And yeah, it is a little bit of a bragging right to be called a doctor for sure. It's a kind of a nice title, especially in our social kind of status and culture that we have here in North America. So yeah, grad school kind of tends to be a little bit more of a intense education or experience as well. The study and expectations have increased a little bit when it comes to quality and quantity as well. Yeah, and a bunch of things. I guess sometimes there's oftentimes more or smaller kind of class sizes, which is nice. You get to develop a little bit stronger relationships with your professors and your peers as well. More focused studies, specific discipline, you really get to hone in on a certain topic and really become an expert in it, more than kind of people with an undergrad or people just within society. Yeah, networking opportunities are fantastic as well, whether that's academics or researchers or sometimes even employers as well. Yeah, and sometimes there's work experience involved. So I think I have it on a different slide, but I can talk about it now. There's kind of three categories that we tend to generally talk about when it comes to further education. There's kind of course-based, so kind of really just taking the courses if that's what you're wanting to focus on, so that knowledge acquisition. There is that kind of research-based, which is probably most applicable to the majority of you, where you're getting a chance to really work on a more intense kind of research project. But there are kind of applied types of masters and PhDs, well, probably more masters than PhDs. But that gives you a chance to actually get some work experience, and there might be supervision or something involved in that, depending on what direction you're going. Yeah, I feel like undergrad hasn't let me dive into specific field of physics as much as I'd like to. Yeah, you want to get a little bit more specific, get a little bit more advanced knowledge, really dig into it. When you find that topic, yeah, it's one of those things you notice in like talking with people too, where you'll want to talk about a certain topic for maybe half an hour, and other people are quick to kind of move on. It's like, no, I want to talk about it for longer. I'm not done with this topic yet. That's when you know you've kind of found the right thing that you're passionate about. Getting to work closely with an expert in your area of interest. Yeah, absolutely. Stronger mentorship, learning from their processes, their approach, the way they think about things. Yeah. A couple other things. Sometimes it leads to a higher salary, so having a higher income. Some people want to go to graduate school, but they're not quite sure why or like what for, but they just want to kind of advance themselves. Sometimes there's kind of the social pressure too. Well, everybody's kind of going to grad school, so maybe I should too. I think in response to the pandemic as well, a lot of people have kind of defaulted to, well, I'll kind of just go get further education as well. Some people just really enjoy the educational environment. They thrive in it. And some people are maybe putting off the job search a little bit too. So a couple of those that I kind of mentioned from the slide are maybe a little bit of red flags, just because I think you want to be really intentional. And I think you really want to have a purpose for why you're attending further education, thinking about how will that experience add to your skill set, add to your kind of knowledge base, and really trying to connect that to some career opportunities or career options beyond that too. So really having that thought out, I think is really important. So I'm going to actually share our handout here with the rest of the group. And feel free to download that and make some kind of comments in it and stuff. So I'll just kind of show you what it looks like. So at the top, we're going to kind of start with this first box here. Where I want you to kind of write down a couple reasons and what your focus is when it comes to researching or looking at grad schools. And it's helpful to have it in a little bit of a condensed kind of, here are some key reasons, here are some key ideas that are really kind of motivating me to pursue further education. So maybe just give you about 3 minutes here to jot down a couple notes. And for those who are mentoring other students, feel free to save this to share with your mentees as well. Okay, let's keep moving on. So we got enough time to get to all the content. So I think a question for students who are at least at Queen's, feel free to, if you're not quite sure, you're kind of exploring kind of the why would I kind of attend further education, feel free to book a career consultation or career counseling appointment. And I'm sure like most schools, most programs do have career services or offer career appointments. So feel free to connect with your local services too. But a couple of things that I guess I'm kind of thinking about or I'm kind of exploring with students is, are you ready to focus on that subject and that subject alone? So thinking about how passionate you are about maybe doing that research or kind of getting involved in that practicum if there is one. Is it a primary career path you want to pursue? So kind of usually kind of check like, how have you explored other options? What kind of experience do you have in doing some of these things? So really kind of checking to see, have you tried maybe doing a little bit of research so far and you really enjoyed that? Because it is a large investment, both kind of time, effort, and of financial resources as well. So just making sure that those are kind of in line and in path with a career that's going to be fulfilling for you. What skills and experiences they're seeking. So are you going to be competitive in those applications too? Have you tried it out a little bit? And are you going to feel confident with that or with that credential? So once you graduate and you have that kind of PhD or master's, whatever it may be, do you think that that's really going to kind of add to your bag, as I kind of talk about when it comes to applying for jobs after? Because really, whether it comes to graduating from undergrad, or whether it's applying for jobs or applying for further education, a big piece of what you're going to have to do is kind of marketing yourself and making the argument, I know I will succeed in this job because, or I know I will succeed in this program because. So making sure you've thought through some of those pieces too. And I think it's helpful to check with people who work in the field too, or have done kind of some of that research stuff before, because they're going to know the ins and the outs of that experience and what's really required to succeed in them too. So sometimes you get those really kind of specific tips that are going to make a difference when it comes to your applications, and really making sure that that's an experience that's going to work for you as well. All right, let's dig into some of the different pieces of the application process. So we're going to talk a little bit about researching programs, making sure you're understanding the requirements, setting a bit of a criteria to create a short list. As you can see, you might be able to see that on the second page of that handout I shared. There's kind of some pieces in there. Talking to potential supervisors, that tends to be one of the kind of first early steps. Thinking about international considerations. We'll talk a little bit about some visas and some other things to consider if you are looking at international studies. And then we'll dig a little bit into application timelines, deadlines, funding, and references too. So this is just kind of a reminder, as I'm kind of chatting through some of the pieces here, feel free to make some notes on the second page of that handout, whether it comes to especially the questions piece. Do you have specific questions about your situation that you're hoping to find some answers for? Usually you kind of have specific questions that are, yeah, as I said, kind of unique to your situation. So as I'm walking through some of the content, you may need to check with somebody who works in that faculty or in that program, or even check in with an admissions advisor. So anytime you're looking at a program and there's kind of a contact information, usually that leads to chatting with an admissions advisor. And I kind of make the joke, these people get paid to answer your questions, so keep them employed. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Really encourage people to do that. Yeah, so, and don't stress too much. Like if you can't find an answer online, don't kind of stress yourself out too much about it. Just follow up with an admissions advisor. And we'll dig into some factors later on. But as we're chatting through, if key factors or things that are most important to you in selecting a program kind of come up, feel free to make note of them. So researching programs, a couple different strategies, websites. There are a couple kind of central pathways depending on where you're going, like OLSAS, OMSAS. Depends what field you're kind of looking into. Otherwise, you might want to look at ontariocolleges.ca, gradschools.com, petersons.com, graduate guide. There are quite a few kind of resources online to check it out, and even just grad school programs for blank. And I would try a variety of keywords when you're doing that, because sometimes different provinces or different even countries might call the same kind of occupation something a little bit slightly different. So testing out a couple different keywords is helpful for that too. And I think also like talking to people who work in that field and getting a feel for what programs are kind of maybe seen as the most prestigious, or what are the programs that maybe specialize in certain topics or are kind of the experts in certain topics is helpful too. Another thing to think about when researching programs, especially research ones, is to maybe check in with some professors who work there. If you're interested specifically in doing kind of a PhD or something that's research based, sometimes my recommendation is actually following the research. So if you are kind of looking at the literature, who are the authors that are commonly kind of producing literature for that field, especially in the area, like when you get specific and there's something specific you want to focus on or kind of dig into, take note of who some of those researchers are, and then see where they're working, whether it's at a university, or if it's at a university, I guess you could check out their program. And you may even want to kind of reach out and see if they're open to, or if they're looking to take on students for next year or the following year, just to get a feel for where they're at when it comes to potentially lining up a supervisor as well. And it's never a bad idea. I kind of say this when it comes to networking in general, like have that conversation with them, but closer to the end of it, ask if they have any suggestions or recommendations for other people that maybe they would think it would be helpful for you to chat with or connect with too. So kind of keep that networking path kind of moving forward. So it's a good strategy. You might want to try and connect with maybe some graduate students who are already maybe in a program of interest, talking to people who are going through the experience right now, or even some recent graduates too. A couple strategies for doing that. You might be able to ask an admissions advisor. Sometimes they'll connect you with a current student. They might have connections within that program. So that's something to maybe recommend. Alternatively, if you have experience or you're familiar with LinkedIn, you can research or go to the school's page. And on that kind of page, there's a little alumni tab. So you can open up that kind of alumni search tool and maybe find people who've graduated from that program recently. Excuse me. And if permissions allow, you might be able to reach out and have a bit of a conversation with them about what their experience was like in that program, where they kind of ended up after, how they made that transition, and even where maybe some of their classmates or other people from that program have ended up too.
If I may, Josh, I really like that suggestion. In particular, at the Institute and a part of the astroparticle physics network, we encourage students to check in with those professors, but they often have students within the group that are very willing to talk about what that experience is like working with the faculty member and other team members within the collaboration. So I'm very keen on that suggestion. It's a great one.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something we really do recommend when it comes to just about any career is that networking piece and really starting to chat with people about their experiences. It's where you find the little pieces of information, the tips that can make a big difference when you're chatting with other people too. If you're knowledgeable about it, it stands out and it's noticeable. People like that. Yeah. So some questions you maybe want to think about asking. What are the faculty interests and their research areas? What's the reputation of that school or that faculty? So where do they kind of sit within the knowledge base, the literature as well? What are the quality of resources available? Whether that's kind of funding or whether that's kind of lab tools, resources, equipment, research materials, student supports, could be a variety of things that you want to think about when it comes to those resources. Any other questions that come to mind for folks when it comes to researching schools or things that they maybe want to find out before they start applying?
May I add one?
Sure.
What is the geographic town or the location like?
Yeah.
Can I accommodate my needs in that space or find community outside of the academic bubble?
Mm-hmm. That was actually a big reason why I chose, not a big reason, one of the reasons why I chose to study in Chicago. I was really interested in living in Chicago. It's also a sports city, which was what I was studying too. But yeah, I wanted to live in Chicago. Living expenses in the area, yeah, for sure. What's the cost of living there? Yeah.
May I add one that I found useful?
Mm-hmm.
I found it quite useful when talking to profs, but also students of the prof, is what is the advising style that they have? Like, are they hands-on or hands-off, and whether that fits with you?
Yeah, for sure. That mentorship style is a big piece. Yeah. How available are they? How often are they willing to meet? Yeah, lots of those pieces. So knowing the potential requirements, some things to kind of keep on your radar that are kind of common or things to think about. So the academic achievement piece, what's the GPA requirements? Is there a certain degree that you have to have in order to apply? Something I really kind of try and put on students' radar early on if they're trying to explore grad school programs is are there essential courses that you have to take? And in those courses, do you have to get a certain grade as well, just to make sure you're lining up with some of those essentials, checking to see if there's standardized exams required. They're less common in Canada. In the US, they're much more common. So just something to be aware of, and planning when you're going to take that test as well. At least the MCAT and LSAT, which is medical school and law schools, a lot of students will take it this summer before their fourth year, so they can really focus and hone in on doing well on that test. So if that's something you're navigating, you might want to plan out when you're going to dedicate time to preparing for those tests as well. Is there research experience required, teaching experience, or industry experience required? Those are a little bit less common, but those experiences are also things that are going to help you to put together a strong application. Because ultimately, the question that the university is going to be sorting through or asking themselves is, do we know that this student is going to succeed in this program? And when they graduate, well, one, do we know that they're going to graduate? And two, do we feel like they're going to be successful and contribute to the field after they graduate too? So that's kind of the big question that they're reviewing. And there's specific pieces they'll look for within those. Some programs will want a portfolio, might be kind of research papers that you might have to submit if you have research experience. And references. Yeah, this is something to maybe think about kind of early on as well too, especially kind of in your, I like to suggest kind of third year, fourth year, your last couple of years, because you kind of get higher level courses, and oftentimes those course sizes, like how many people are in them, tends to decrease a little bit. So it's a little bit easier to develop a bit of a relationship with your professors. But a lot of programs will ask for 2 academic, at least 1 academic for sure, but 2 academic references. So really we want those references to be able to speak to our character. So how we kind of work, how we kind of collaborate when it comes to completing projects, but also were they good? So did you do well in that course too? And then there might be 1 professional or 1 personal, which means you can include a reference from maybe a part-time job or doing some work outside of academia as well. Something else to think about with those 2 is, actually, I'll dig into that when I get to it. I got to reference this slide. I get ahead of myself sometimes. Some international considerations. So I think there's a whole extra kind of list of extra things you want to kind of be thinking about. And some of them are definitely kind of similar, so like where you're going to live, how you're going to get food and water, what's the culture like there, what's it going to be like adjusting to that, can you speak the language, are you going to have to maybe learn the language, but one of maybe the earliest things to put on your radar, one of the earliest things to put on your radar is a student visa, because that's kind of one of the essential things to be in that country, to stay in that country while you're studying. And that also takes a little bit of time to move through that process as well. So really that's probably one of my first steps if you're looking at studying abroad, is what's the student visa situation like? What's the process look like? What are the things you have to do for that? Another kind of back end piece, so once you graduate, something to also think about is, will that credential from that country be recognized in Canada? And how will it be perceived by the academic community? If there's a credential that you're kind of pursuing, that you're hoping to do in Canada, making sure that it's going to translate over. And if you're not quite sure, follow up with that institution that provides a credential in Canada. And just seeing what's their process for that, how would they kind of review that or see that. Sometimes there's like equivalency tests, or sometimes there's kind of just extra forms or kind of extra analysis that the credential body will kind of do to see how that works. But something to definitely check out before you kind of invest in that pathway, just because you want to make sure on the back end when you're done, it's going to actually apply for the goals that you're hoping to achieve.
Josh, I see in the chat that one of our colleagues asked the question from back the last slide: would a research supervisor be an academic or a personal reference in your opinion?
That would be academic, because you're working within like an academic institution. Yeah, and it's also working on like a knowledge base. So it's kind of an academic pursuit. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, it's a big check mark to kind of have off is getting those academic references.
And so that might be somebody then that speaks to your work, right? The academic work that you have been doing versus someone that knows you personally who can speak to your merits.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes actually our research supervisors can do a really good job of speaking to our character too, and how we do work personally. I think you do want to think about like what are, sometimes when I work with students, we'll talk about, okay, when you're applying for this, what are some of the really big key messages you want to make sure that they're understanding and getting about you? And some of those are probably going to be academic pieces, but some of them are going to be character traits too, in how you work, how you engage with your research. Are you disciplined? When things don't go right with your research, how do you adjust and maybe manage some of those things too? So that's just a couple examples, but.
So along that lines, Ty asks, are references usually program specific?
They're probably pretty consistent when it comes to like across a certain field. You'll notice patterns, but yes, I remember when I was researching for my grad school programs, some of them required 2 that had to be academic and 1 had to be kind of professional. The program I applied to had 1 had to be academic, 1 had to be professional, and then there was like a flex one. So the third one could be either academic or it could also be kind of professional. So it will be a little bit different depending on the program. Good question. Sometimes that helps you kind of make a decision on which program to apply to if you feel like you got a stronger, maybe third reference that's professional.
Here we go. Now we've opened up the floodgates with really good questions. Thanks everyone in the audience. Can you talk about COVID and GRE dynamic that has been going on since in the last year? Many universities that had GRE or PGRE as a compulsory requirement have now dropped it altogether. It's confusing whether to attempt it or not, as it does get expensive.
That's a great question.
It's super useful insight too. That's not something that I'd heard about.
Yeah, that's kind of news to me too. I think with the GRE specifically, it's kind of like a bit of a general kind of assessment, right? So I think at least in Canada, just across like the board in the last kind of 5-10 years, I think it's decreased. So I think that's maybe just a pattern of schools or programs potentially not requiring that. And I wonder if it's maybe students are kind of overwhelmed a little bit and they're acknowledging, you know what, people are kind of like acknowledging people might be struggling and stuff. So to add that extra kind of stress is something that they might be taking off. That's I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but that's just something I'm kind of thinking about.
That might be a good question for an admissions individual, right? Just to see, will this be coming back? Is this a 1-year thing? I noticed that my colleague CJ had his hand up. May I invite you, CJ, to join the conversation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. So just a small note on this. I did take a GRE and the physics GRE, which I'm assuming is what is meant by PGRE. I've never seen it abbreviated like that, but it's great. And I did have to take both. Oh, thank you for clarifying. I did have to take both when I went to graduate school like 6 years ago. And there was talk at the time of removing the GRE and physics GRE requirements from a lot of physics programs throughout the United States. So I don't know if it's COVID related or maybe this was their catalyst that they needed to remove those requirements. But there was actually a lot of talk over the last few years about removing these tests because it has shown that someone scoring really well on either of these exams does not necessarily indicate their research capability or how good of a graduate student, whatever that means, they are. And then in the reverse, someone who scores poorly could be a fantastic researcher. So yeah, it was already in the works several years ago that a lot of schools and a lot of programs were saying we don't care about your GRE scores. And then it just needed time to go through that red tape to get it removed. So I'm not sure if it was actually COVID related or not, but that's a good question. I think it would be really a good idea to just make sure that you're up to date on the current requirements for those, because you're right, it is really expensive. And if you can avoid it, that is a big plus.
And that's something to maybe keep track of when you are kind of deciding on the factors for applying for programs. If it's a stress you don't want to add, it might not be like the hinge factor, like this is my yes or no kind of determinant, but it might be something to factor into your decision when it comes to shortlisting what programs you want to apply to, for sure.
Yeah, I
So-
put out an unpopular opinion, but just thinking about that stress and that load in your final year and applying, it's okay to take an extra semester in your undergrad or an extra year while you're thinking about it, or maybe a gap year in between working and building skills. I'm asking that rhetorically, but I would like to put it out there that that's not an impossibility for people.
Yeah, I think there's lots of advantages to taking a gap year. I think I remember after I kind of graduated, there's kind of the idea that, you know, if you don't continue with school, you're never going to go back. It was kind of this myth that people talk about. That's definitely not the case. I think actually when people get some experience and kind of maybe try out a couple industries or get into certain companies and stuff, it actually can be a motivator to be like, you know what, I really want to up my kind of knowledge base and I want to get specifically into this. And mature students tend to actually do really, really well in further education too, because they have some of those experiences and they've really connected with the value of completing that program too. Not that you have to, it's not necessary. If you find the right thing and it works for you and you're ready to do it right after your undergrad, do it for sure. So I'm not necessarily discouraging you if that's the case, but there are some benefits and there's some value in taking a gap year if you do choose to do that.
Thanks for acknowledging that, Josh.
Yeah. So shifting a little bit back to international considerations, if you can connect with somebody who's done it before, who's kind of maybe gone to a different country and come back to Canada, if that's what you want to do, have a chat with them, ask them what was kind of the difficult parts, what are things to maybe be aware of or prepare before you go. It can make a big difference. If you are going to study abroad, I like to always show this a bit of a cultural adjustment curve. And I definitely went through this when it came to adjusting to Chicago. And I know America doesn't seem like a really different place, but there are definitely some cultural differences. But it can be a bit of an up and down experience. I think when you get there, it's really exciting. But then once kind of the rose-colored glasses kind of come off and things kind of get real, it can drop down a little bit. But then you get excited because something else will happen and you might drop down a little bit again with your emotional. So really what I recommend is check in with your supports, check in with your people. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Yeah, but just like to set people up with expectations that it might be a little bit of an up and down, and that's normal. Okay, so you've found some programs, you've done some research. What are the next steps? I think you want to make a bit of a list on what are some of the factors that are most important to you when it comes to making that decision. So we've already talked about a lot of things. Normally I would kind of ask the audience, but I think we've dug into a bunch of these things, especially with the questions too. But whether it's faculty, the mentorship, who's actually supporting the program, the focus, location. I'm not going to read the whole slide off. We can read it. Status, reputation, cost of program. Can you manage the cost? Oh, one thing I didn't mention about international studies is being aware of what the kind of financial requirements are for doing that as well. When I went and studied in Chicago there, I actually had to have access and like the availability of all of the funding for the entire program for the full 2 years. And I was personally working off some student loans, which only gave you half of the funding that you kind of had for the 2 years. So it was a bit of a hiccup for me to kind of plan, okay, well, I've got to all of a sudden kind of have access to this extra funding when I cross the border to move there. So that was something I had to kind of work through, but just being aware of how that piece plays into it.
One thing I notice about this list, Josh, and I don't know who's in the audience per se to know if anyone has the situation, but for mature students that might be going back or selecting graduate school, who might have families or partners who might move with them, whether they be international or domestic, right? That's another factor to consider as to whether or not your partner can find work in a location, or if your children might be going into schools or daycares. What kind of supports are there for them? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And maybe part of that too is researching what are there like kind of employment agencies or career resources available at the school to kind of support that transition, or maybe the local employment agencies too. I know here in Kingston, there's a employment agency called Keys, and they actually have a bit of a partner transition program. So people who are moving to here to maybe work at Queens, we oftentimes will connect some of their partners and stuff with that local agency just to help them with that career transition as well. So that's, yeah, thanks for that heads up. It's a good idea. I'm going to add it to the slide. Okay, so finding a potential supervisor. Once again, I think it's really helpful to start with the research that they've done, especially if you're doing a research degree, and kind of just jump off the literature that's out there, and have a conversation with them if you can, see who else they maybe recommend you connect with, chat with a faculty member, maybe a current student or former student, as I mentioned. And then kind of digging into what's that supervisory relationship going to be like. I think this is something to really check in to make sure you're both in line, and your work style is going to work with their kind of mentorship style. So one, what's their expertise like? Do they have experience with supervision? They might be an expert in a topic, but just kind of getting into maybe an academic role where they do have to supervise. So checking in with that experience. What's their availability going to be like? What's their research agenda? So there might be opportunities to support them in their research too. You might not be the primary author, but you might be a secondary or tertiary author on those too. And just thinking maybe I want to kind of help them out with their kind of upcoming goals. How often do they publish? And I guess the interpersonal relationship too. So yeah, Hawking got a question there.
I like this question. From my research, most Canadian physics master's programs seem to cover all tuition and a little bit of living cost. Is that true? Are there other fees students should consider?
I think that's pretty common in a lot of fields, not all of them though. So also thinking about how they're kind of providing that funding. So whether it's like a grant or a research funding specifically that provides it, sometimes there's like a TA-ship that helps you, like you work the TA-ship and that helps to kind of afford the program as well. I don't know, I think it's really specific program by program and how much funding they kind of allot to that. That's good, you're noticing a bit of a trend, so I think that's a positive thing. But within the research field, I do feel like that's a little bit more common than some other ones.
The only piece that I'll add to that comment, Hawking, is in addition to tuition, ensure that is covering student fees as well. So library, grad club, the Society for Graduate and Professional Students at Queen's, the union, that kind of fees that might be associated with it. I recall doing my PhD and that taught me up an extra $1,000 a year if I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, and something to think about too is the quality of life that you want to kind of have while you're studying too. Not that you probably don't want to expect to live lavishly and super kind of really high quality of life, but making sure you're kind of, shelter, food, water, the essentials are going to be covered and it's going to be comfortable for you. And even digging into if they provide accommodations, what are those accommodations like? Is that going to be an environment that's going to set you up for success and stuff too? Yeah. How many slides do I got left here? We got about maybe 5 minutes. I want to make sure we have time for questions.
We can go a little bit over, Josh, but I respect some of our colleagues may have to jump for 1 o'clock or another time, depending on where they're calling in.
Okay. Great, thanks. Yeah, so I guess this is just kind of homework for you to take with you. On the back side of that kind of worksheet, what are some of those factors and prioritize them? So put them in maybe you want to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, how it's important to you, or maybe you want to order them in preference. But I think it's really important to know what are the things that you definitely want out of this experience and looking for programs that are going to match that as much as possible. So managing timelines, thinking about when should I do these things? I think it's really helpful to get a feel for when are the deadlines. Usually they're between like November all the way to like February, March. Some programs might even have what they call rolling admissions. So as applications come in, they'll accept students up to a certain point. So thinking, well, maybe I want to submit a little bit earlier just to make sure I get considered for this. Excuse me. Yeah, so managing that and working backwards from it. Think about what you have to prepare. And I always say leave kind of time for 2 extra weeks, if not 3 extra weeks, for those unexpected challenges. You never know what hiccups might kind of happen, and you don't want that to happen on the very last day, and then you have to submit something that's not as great as you maybe hoped. So make sure your CV is in good place, your personal statement or research statement, at least kind of 2 months out. I think you'll kind of write that and look at a first draft and be like, am I doing this right? Maybe I should kind of rewrite it or kind of dig through some of the extra pieces. And we've actually got a couple supports for that, which I'll dig into in a little bit. Your references, I always recommend 2 to 3 months out. Professors get busy. They probably have other people who are asking for references too. So be the person who's ahead of schedule. It looks positive as well, which might kind of reflect in your reference too, but give them lots of time and lots of ability to manage that in their schedule too. Depending on your relationship with the reference, if it's a strong relationship, you might want to even consider, here are a couple things I thought you might want to touch on. Of course, it's their reference. Of course, it's up to them. But if you're having a specific approach in putting your application together, and this reference can talk about this, and this other reference can talk about this and this, that gives them a little bit of guidance. And they it makes their life a little bit easier too. They don't have to come up with all the content themselves. Consider the deadlines for internal and external funding. So are there a lot of actually the Ontario grants and stuff actually are due in like September, October, early fall. So you might want to maybe apply for some grants and stuff before you're kind of looking at applications, but factoring that into your timeline as well. Connecting with a potential supervisor. So a couple quick tips, things to think about when you are doing that initial outreach. Introducing yourself, maybe a couple quick kind of details. You don't want this to be too long. So you want to kind of cut to the chase, because once again, respecting their time. If it's a long kind of email, it takes time and effort to kind of go through it. So a little bit of a surface level kind of big picture stuff. You want to include who you are, why you want to maybe focus on a certain topic, what it can maybe touching on briefly what experience you have with it. And then I think you want to transition into explaining why you're reaching out to this person. And this is really a check to make sure you've done some of your homework and maybe a little bit of flattery too. Like, why are you reaching out to them? What article have they maybe done that you want to maybe follow up on or further? What expertise they have and why you're interested in connecting with them. Maybe even the program that they're kind of supervising for too. There might be elements of it that you're really interested in. You looked at them, and I think just giving a little bit of a rationale. Once again, not going on too long. You'll probably talk about it a little bit in that conversation with them, but touching on some of the key points. Giving a bit of a heads up on what you want to work on. And then kind of going through some of the details of, do you maybe have a half hour to have a conversation with me about the potential of maybe kind of getting into the program and any tips you have for applying to the program. You might want to ask kind of outright, are you looking or are you currently accepting students for the upcoming year or the following year? So getting a feel for where they're at with that planning. Yeah, and being grateful. Thank them for their time, for their consideration. Even if they don't follow up or even if they don't kind of confirm it, it's still good to be polite. Especially, it's definitely a very Canadian thing too. I kind of call it passive politeness. We're very, very considerate and polite with other people when it comes to professional world. Funding services or funding sources, a bunch of things to kind of look at, see what the university offers, check out the Canadian Research Councils, check out the grants register 2021. Usually you can find it in like your school's library. There's oftentimes like an online resource that you can check out, but that's a really good kind of master list of what's kind of going on when it comes to funding. A few tips on references. I think I talked about a lot of these already. people you know well. Yeah, courses that you did well in. Approach 2 to 3 months ahead of time. If you're taking a gap year or you're not necessarily going to go directly into further education, still connect with kind of the professors in your final year and just give them a heads up. Hey, I'm thinking about applying to grad school. Would you be comfortable with me reaching out in next year or a few years to see if you'd be interested in kind of providing a reference for that? And that's really just giving them a heads up to write down a couple notes and let them know, like, because then they can kind of plan for, well, if I'm going to have to do that in the future, here are a couple things I maybe want to kind of store in my documents so that I can recall my memory and my experience with the student. So I know we're nearing 1 o'clock. So students if people have to go, feel free to, but I got maybe 5 minutes here. Yeah, I believe I can share kind of the slides after. I'll share them in a PDF format, but I'll give them to Alex to circulate out. Sorry, go ahead.
I love this. I love these suggestions that you're making here, because the other one that I was thinking about as you were talking about funding is, if you're in your second or even your third year and you're just not sure if you want to do grad school yet, or if you're really interested in research, it seems like something you might be interested in, but how do you know before you commit to 2 years of paying tuition and going to a new school? And being a part of research projects and other activities, you can be asking your faculty member now, hey, do you have a summer internship or a lab opportunity next summer that I can participate in? Can I apply for an NSERC USRA Undergraduate Summer Research Award?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, lots of opportunities, and it's good to just I kind of say put the energy out there, start exploring, start asking people, start talking to people about it, and the energy kind of comes back. Opportunity or suggestions or programs and stuff, you'll learn about them when you kind of put that energy out there. So I really do recommend that. And a couple of things on this slide to consider. Don't wait till the last minute. Okay, so just wrapping up, a couple resources, Queen specific resources. I mentioned kind of our career appointments. We also have resume and cover letter review appointments. If you put together a research statement and you want some feedback on it, feel free to book a career consultation and we'll kind of go over it with you and kind of think through some of the pieces that you're including in there. If you have a quick question about researching grad schools and stuff, feel free to visit us at Drop-In. And the link is in our My Career Events calendar. And that's Monday to Thursday, 1:30 to 3:30. We're going to offer that both in person and virtually in the fall. So whatever kind of format works for you, that works great. And check in with your own school too. They'll probably have some similar kind of resources as well. And then when it comes to virtual resources, if you're thinking about just like how I want to approach my application, you might want to think about the Queen skills cards and even reflecting on what are the transferable skills that are going to allow me to be successful as a student in this program. So those Queen skills cards, there's 44 transferable skills and each card kind of breaks down one of them with the components and an example and stuff. So it's just a helpful reflection activity. And check out our tip sheets online too. We've got a couple that relate to grad school, whether it's kind of doing the personal research statement, putting together a CV, / resume. And then there's a couple specific ones for a couple specific type of programs, which maybe aren't as relevant for you folks. Yeah. And those are available to everybody. And that's all I got today. So I guess we'll take some questions if people have them.